First of all, I just cannot believe that these scientists were willing to come and tell us all those great things. So I'd like to thank them all very much. It was fascinating. Now that we've come to the musical portion of the afternoon, I want to tell you a little bit about the piece to hopefully give you an even more rich and chill-inducing experience of this, which is just a fantastic, fantastic piece of music. So one of the things that Mike Randall mentioned in the first lecture is that there are different groups of instruments that produce sounds in different ways, specifically wind instruments, stringed instruments, and percussion instruments. One thing that's very interesting about this particular piece, the trio in E-flat, Opus 40 by Johannes Brahms, is that there's one instrument from each of those groups. Now, you may be looking around for the drum set and wondering where the percussionist is. In fact, the piano is essentially a percussion instrument. The way the piano works, and at the end of the performance, if anybody wants to come up and look into the inside of a piano, it's a fascinating thing. And what the piano has is little hammers that come up and hit the string. Percussion instruments make their sound by hitting, by being percussive. And when you hear the piano play a big roll of beautiful chords like this, you don't think of it as a percussion instrument, but in fact, every one of those notes is created by one hammer hitting a string that plays a particular pitch. Our mind combines all of those separate sounds, as we've been hearing about, into something that makes sense as a unit. We would call it a chord or a wash of sound or something like that. We hear it as one thing. Actually, this is a fascinating instrument because it's a percussion instrument that plays melodies, it's melodic, and it plays harmonies, it's harmonic. Then we have a stringed instrument, violin, my personal favorite instrument. And the violin produces sound in two different ways. There's a bow, and the bow has horsehair in it, if you can just hold it up. So the white stuff is actually hair from the tail of a horse, and it has little teeny micro fibers that stick off it that you can see under a microscope. And you rub sticky stuff, which is called rosin, which is like what you get if you cut a pine branch. There's sticky stuff in there. And Felicia puts this sticky stuff called rosin on, and then the little fibers that hang off of the horsehairs catch on the string, and they make it vibrate. So you can hear a note like that. One thing that's interesting about all of these instruments is there is a lowest note. So the lowest note on the piano is here, and it's a decent piano, so you can actually tell what note it is. Some pianos, it just sounds like There's a lowest note on the violin as well, and she can't play any lower than that. There's a highest note on the piano, 88 notes away from the lowest, and there's not really a highest note on the violin, although for all practical purposes there sort of is, but it can keep going higher and higher because the string can get shorter and shorter and shorter. As you know, between any 2 points, you can always draw another point. So wherever Felicia puts her finger, theoretically, there's another spot between there and the bridge of the instrument where she can put. Now, I don't know if you'd want to listen to any of that, but right. So composers often don't write those notes because they're not particularly moving, but they exist. The French horn can play very low and very high. There are theoretical lowest notes, but they are so low. I've only heard one person in my whole career play the lowest theoretical note that can be played on the horn. And he played it great. And oddly, his name is Howard, which is another story entirely. And then the horn theoretically can play higher and higher and higher, although the strength of our lips puts a practical limit on how high we can play. Now, the French horn is similar to all of the brass instruments in that it's played with the lips. The instrument itself is just a hollow tube. This is incredibly complicated looking, but it's a hollow tube that's bent in all kinds of shapes, and it's bent up this way for ease of transportation, basically. You could have a French horn that was 28 feet long. You would have trouble getting it on the bus, and it's not practical. But if you see old movies where there's Romans and they're playing da-da-da-da-da on their trumpets, and they're long, what are called herald trumpets, there you have an example of a very long brass instrument. Doesn't need to be rolled up These are so long that they need to be rolled up. But inside, it's nothing but a hollow tube, a hollow brass tube. And we use our lips to play like that, and we play into the, do that into the mouthpiece. That's sort of my excuse to do a little warming up while I'm on the subject. And that's how we play the horn. Now, not to go on at too great a length, but now you got me started, so what can I do? Classical musicians tend to be extraordinarily conservative. You have to remember that. These are violins that have not changed in 500 years. The piano, when was the modern piano created? Not much change in 120 years, until now when our very own Kit Taylor is inventing a new kind of piano. And stay tuned with Wharf, you'll be seeing all about that in the future. A piano with 2 different keyboards. And the French horn, I mean, it's a hollow tube. What can you do with it, right? Well, the answer is you can put valves on. So when I push a valve down, it adds a little length of tubing. What happens when you make when you have a longer piece of equipment? What happens to the note? Higher or lower? Lower, right? That's why the far side of the piano is big, the near side is little, because you got short strings up here where it's high, long strings down there. That's why the piano is shaped this way. The violin is a little different. The strings are the same length, but they're under different tensions. So Felicia can change the tension with the peg, if you don't mind just going. Is that okay? Oh, no. So now I blew it. So there you go. There's a great example. She's changing not the length of the string, but the tension under which it is strung. The piano strings are under very great tension. They can be tuned in a similar way. There's a lot of them. It's a giant pain. So the French horn has these valves. They were invented in around 1820. I'll show you when I play a note. Anytime I push down this first one, the note's going to go down by a whole step. Even if I have another one down and I push the first one down, it'll go down by the same amount. So this system was invented around 1820. It was adopted not till the 1880s, not regularly until the 20th century. Brahms lived from, anybody know his dates? I don't know exactly. Do you know them, kid? 97, yeah, 1831 to 1897. So he lived through the period where the valves had become good, and most of his fellow composers were writing for the horn with valves. Before that, you had horns without valves. They could only play a fixed series of notes called the harmonic series. You heard Mike Randall refer to the harmonic series. In this case, Brahms wrote for an E-flat horn. Those are the notes that are available to the E-flat horn. Brahms stuck with the natural horn, the horn without valves. He said, I don't like this newfangled invention at all. It doesn't sound good. And every note he wrote for the French horn was written for the French horn without any valves. When you hear the complexity of the harmonies in this piece, you're going to wonder how you could play this thing on a French horn without valves. One of the things that makes Brahms such a brilliant composer, especially as far as a French horn player is concerned, is what he was able to do with this instrument, given its tremendous limitations. Now we play mostly modern horns. We don't have such limitations, but it's interesting to think of what that horn could do and what Brahms did with it. And I want to, because I'm on that subject, I'm going to talk about this piece in reverse order very briefly. The last movement is a hunting movement. It's basically like hunting music. That's something that the horn does very well. You don't need any valves to do it. You could do something like this. And play that without any valves at all. And you'll hear, when you listen to the last movement, that we are playing hunting music. Going backwards, the third movement was written after Brahms's mother died. He was very close to his mother. This piece was written in the middle of Brahms's life, and he wrote an extremely emotionally affecting movement. It's absolutely beautiful, and you might want to consider what our ear and emotion and brain people were talking about, how music affects us emotionally, because this movement does. It really does. It's spectacular. One thing that was talked about towards the end of the afternoon was the role of expectation. The second movement is what's called a scherzo. A scherzo is a fast movement. Scherzo means joke. The music isn't always jokey. It is not in this case. But it's a fast movement that's always in the time of 3/4, 3 beats to the measure. And scherzos have very definite form. They have an opening section, they have a second section, and then they do something contrasting called a trio, and then they go back and they repeat the opening section and the second section, and that's where they end. Composers know audiences are sophisticated. Now, unfortunately, audiences today are not so sophisticated. We don't have music teaching in the schools. People don't know much about classical music. So it becomes more difficult for modern audiences to appreciate what composers are doing. You are probably a fairly sophisticated audience, and you'll recognize as we go through this scherzo that certain things happen that you expect to happen. And because of that, there's all these wonderful little details. Composers can put in all these fun details that you notice because you kind of know what the story is going to be. The story is going to be, it's fast, it's upbeat, it chugs along, then it changes to a different kind of theme, and then there's a new section, and then we go back. I've gone in reverse order because the first movement is very bizarre for music of this period. It has a section in which you have no idea which beat is the strong beat, and if you don't mind, can you tune and then play the first 8 bars? That's okay.
When one string pops down like that, they all go out, so that's fine. That's good enough for now.
Okay, so before you play, listen to see if you can tell which beat is the strong beat and which beat is the weak beat. There's 2 beats per measure. One is strong, one is weak. So to me, it sounds like the beat where the piano plays, that's the strong beat. But in fact, that's the weak beat. And Brahms loves playing with where is the downbeat, where's the strong beat in all of his pieces. And if you get into Brahms and you say, hey, I want to listen to some more Brahms, it's all over YouTube. You can listen for free. You'll see that you constantly are confused as to where the beat is. It's music that floats because of that. You're unanchored and you're free to kind of drift around, and then at a certain point, and this is where we get to the concept of expectation, at a certain point we go, kabam, and you go, oh, I get it now. And that feeling of being floaty and then hitting the ground, if you've ever been on a boat and the water's a little bit choppy, and then you step off that boat onto the pier and you go, that's a kind of what's happening in the music as well. So here's the Brahms Horn Trio. Thank you so much. We're going way over time. I really appreciate your patience. I have to take this stuff off, and then we'll play. It's in 4 movements.